Okay, so thank you, Mr. Malaz Daoud. What I'm going to do is I am going to ask all of you to unmute. That is Mr. Postdot, Tim Foxley, and Mr. Malaz. And yeah, thank you for your presentations. I think we have covered a variety of things here. Um, we have talked about ISIS in where they were in Syria and Iraq, in Afghanistan, the challenges they face, the prospects they might have, even in Kashmir. What we have also seen when Mr. Malaz was talking about Kashmir, because there are many attendees from Kashmir as well. Of course, and that's also something you've seen in Afghanistan. Of course, any issues which are there are very regional to the region. And they're mostly embedded in politics rather than thoughts of the greater ummah, wrong thoughts of the greater ummah. So I'm going to read out a few, actually all questions. Um, and anyone can answer them. So it's open for everyone. First of all, there's one question is um, uh, how will this something was asking the deal between US and Taliban, um, that is the questioner thinks that is not a good deal for India, and he wants to ask what impact will it have on India, and and a footnote to that um, is that yeah, two questions which are together. One is what is then the next question is what is the role of India to stop ISIS activity in South Asia, and I think the most important one is um, though India played a good role in the development of Afghanistan, but unfortunately it did not or has not gotten a chance in the Taliban USA deal. Do you feel that this deal is then incomplete without taking such a big regional player into consideration? And how can that be solved, and how will it impact India? So anyone who wants to answer.
Can I take it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The first thing is the deal is yes, it's problematic, but we should remember it's the very first step. Um, and now the talks that are going on, it's not only between the Afghan government and the Taliban, it's between the political forces that are part of the state of Afghanistan, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, that some of those people are not necessarily supportive of the views of the government and the Taliban. And we know from the few days that the talks have been going on, there are a lot of stumbling blocks. So I don't think there will be an intra-Afghan deal before November 3rd, the day that we'll have the elections in the US. Um, but when it comes to the dissolution between the elections in the US and the deal itself, that's also more problematic because the face of the Afghan government is Almay Khalilzad. He's not only an Afghan by birth, but he's also someone who goes way back with President Ashraf Ghani. And they're known to have been rivals for a very long time. So it's also about scoring points against each other. So every time Khalilzad made some progress, Ashraf Ghani tried to sabotage that. And Khalilzad, while advancing the agenda of the US government, was also advancing his own personal agenda. When it comes to India, yes, to be honest, I've been speaking to some Indian diplomats in Germany, and I've been urging them to engage with the Taliban. and I've been doing the same thing because of my connections with the Doha office and Taliban. I've been doing the same thing with the Taliban in Doha, telling them to engage with the Indian state. The problem is the stumbling block, the main one is the Pakistani government. The Pakistani government is not prepared to allow the Taliban in any way or shape to have any engagement with the Indian government at this point. However, when it comes to the Indian government's counter ISIS and also counter any jihadi outfit efforts, I'll give you the example of one small contribution that looked small, but it was extremely effective. During the 1990s, when Ahmad Shah Massoud was fighting against the Taliban, he was getting support from different countries, the US, Russia, Iran, and India. However, people close to him would always mention this one hospital that the Indians had built in Tajikistan for their wounded. India support has been effective, and I think it is important for India when it comes to the to fighting against ISIS that they continue to support the Afghan military forces, the security forces. At the same time, I think India can play a much bigger role on the political level, especially because of the fissures that have come to the fore after the presidential election of Afghanistan in 2014. Other countries have tried to become mediators between different Afghan groups and politicians. I think India can have a much bigger role there. So once you have this cohesion in the political setup in Kabul, I guess you have much better chance of countering the Taliban, the influence of the Pakistani state, and also obviously ISIS.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to add to that?
I mean, just to echo all that, really. The American Taliban deal was a very narrow, had a very narrow intent, and it wasn't meant to involve other countries and such like. India has a really important role to play, but whenever I look, I mean, every neighbouring country or near neighbour has history in Afghanistan, and not all of it good. All the neighbours in Iran, Central Asia, you can go around it, and China, and Pakistan, they all have vital roles to play. But they have to play it, particularly at this stage when we're having the talks underway, they have to play it really carefully, because if you push too far forward, you're going to stress out 2 or 3 other factors, pressure groups, political movements, or nations. And the main issue, obviously, is the India-Pakistan rivalry, which is at high risk of being played out again in Afghanistan. So yeah, India, of course, has a vital role to play and has been doing very important things in Afghanistan, economically and politically. But I always get a little bit tense in my stomach when I read about, the Russians talking to the Taliban and the Iranians talking to the Taliban and the Indians. I just worry that things will get overly tangled up. And particularly at this moment, this year is about the Afghan government sitting down and talking to the Taliban. And if they can just about organize, where to sit and what format the talks are going to be taking place by the end of this year, then I'll be happy with that. So we shouldn't try and run before we can walk, I think is my sort of caution. Yeah, India is very important, and it will be very important in the development of Afghanistan, but let's just take it one step at a time.
Okay, Mr. Scott?
Yes, just very briefly, perhaps a slightly different point, but I think it's worth stressing that the Taliban perhaps have an understanding of some of the weaknesses of democratic nations, that obviously they operate to electoral cycles, and certainly some of the Western nations, there's a great deal of public of tiredness among the general public for overseas conflicts, and indeed at least part of Trump's first election campaign was rather stressing that. So I think the Taliban and indeed other actors know that it is possible to wait out some of the players. That of course doesn't apply to those with skin in the game, those who are bordering Afghanistan, Pakistan, and they do need to be to be part of the do need to be part of the solution, and must be if it's going to endure.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions coming in. We are now at still having 12 questions. I hope everyone has the time, but that's interesting. So I'm going to put a few questions together. One is, there's one question to Mr. Paul's thought, and then I'm going to put that together with a few other questions, and anyone can of course comment. One is, do you agree that we should strengthen democracy in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh? And do you also think that we should promote Sufism in entire of South Asia so that such ideologies can counter the Wahhabi influences there? On top of that, another one is, one second. Yeah, there's this one, Mr. Postad, because you have talked to about the West and the British connections. This one is a pretty blunt question, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. Is Kashmir a sale point to keep India and Pakistan in a dispute so that the West can keep selling weapons? And yeah, I think that is for now those 2-3 questions which I can put together, and then we'll go to the next ones.
Shall I go on the Kashmir question?
Mm-hmm.
I think if you remember back to the last time the Kashmir question flared up, and you had the Indian pilots captured in Pakistan, and the brief clashes across the border, the British government was actually quite firm in its position, really, that it's not going to be a referee, it's not going to be an umpire, and these are questions primarily for people in the region to resolve, and I do think that's a sensible position. On the specific question of selling arms and what have you, I haven't followed our trade figures in that area with India and Pakistan, but I can assure you, if British companies weren't involved in it, there'll be plenty of other takers to do business, from Russia through to the French, the Americans, who have you. Unfortunately, there's no lack of would-be suppliers of arms out there.
Let me come in on the question of democracy. It just reminds me of what Bilawal Bhutto, the son of Benazir Bhutto, said when she was killed. He said, democracy is the revenge. So basically, yes, in a democratic system, Taliban and other jihadi outfits are set to lose more, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that democracy is the only answer. State effectiveness is most probably a much better answer in that context in the short term. But when it comes to democracy, especially when it comes to democracy in Afghanistan, the story is very old. Obviously, the story we are told only is after 2001, the international community came in, the Western nations thought, okay, the main problem they have is that they don't have democracy. Whereas in 1960s, we had this wave of democracy in Afghanistan. At the same time, during the 90s, during the Civil War, if you look at the narratives of all main political military actors, they talked about elections as the main vehicle for moving from the violent conflict into a peaceful contestation of politics. So that debate has been there for a very long time now. But it's not only democracy, because if you go to the root of the word democracy, it's mainly about participation of people in politics. So it's not only participation in elections. Right now, the people who are sitting across the table with the Taliban negotiators, there are quite a few of them who are part of the Afghan civil society. So now we have other forces, like literally women talking to the Congress people in the US and forcing them to take Khalilzad and his team to account when it comes to the deal. So we have moved forward, and it is a challenge and a huge one for the Taliban. And because if they become part of the this setup, they are going to lose, and lose big time. There was one of their a journalist who pretended to be, he was a member of Taliban, but pretended to be a journalist, who questioned one of the members of the negotiating team from the other side, saying, well, the elections, the last presidential elections in Afghanistan were very fraudulent, and President Ghani only got 1 million votes. The reply was, yes, he got 1 million votes, but your leader doesn't even have one vote. So it is going to be a sticking point, and a huge one. Like right now, the main sticking point is which jurisprudence they are going to use for the talks. Only Hanafi, the Sunnis, or the Shia ones too, and Taliban are sticking to the Hanafi. So, and obviously when in democracy, that discussion becomes much broader, and obviously then everyone in the society has to participate in it. So for the Taliban, it's going to be a huge challenge. Democracy is the partial answer to terrorism in the region, and especially in countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan.
And what do you think about the West supporting Sufism as to Wahhabism supported by Saudi Arabia and its allies?
Well, Wahhabism is also misunderstood to a certain extent. Like the first kindlings of Wahhabism, the first one was non-violent, and there were Wahhabis in Afghanistan during the jihad of 1980s who were non-violent, who were targeted by the violent side of the Wahhabis. When it comes to Sufism, passive Sufism is not going to help in any way or shape. It is, the resistance should be at the heart of it. Like in the case of Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, if you see their leader, he's a pious Muslim, he prays, he even leads prayers, but at the same time, they have a very strong non-violent resistant movement. So it's not only how you shape the minds of people, it's also how you make sure that no one impresses upon you their views through a non-violent method.
Anyone else wants to add to that, Mr. Fox?
Yeah, just the most general of comments on democracy. it's the easiest thing to talk about. it's that in this part of the world with the problems and constraints and the conflicts and the disruption, it's one of the hardest things to do. And I've in some small way, I've been a tiny part of this process. I've done a couple of tours in their headquarters in Kabul, and I've listened to a lot of the debates and discussions. And I've watched the West trip over itself every year, trying to do the right thing, whatever that is. And 1 minute you're going this way with democracy, 1 minute you're going that way. And I do remember, I saw it on the TV, I didn't see it for real, but I do remember Hamid Karzai in 2004 talking about, this is our golden chance, with the first set of elections, and it was a really exciting time. And I've watched the enthusiasm, each year drain away. And it's a bit ironic of the Taliban to criticize the democratic process. It would be a lot easier to go out to vote if the polling stations weren't being blown up and people weren't being targeted if they have voting ink on the thumbs. But the thing that worries me in terms of peace talks and the Taliban, and Malays has just touched upon this, and you've talked about the Taliban finding democracy a challenge. I don't think it, as we understand the democratic process, I don't think it's going to enter the Taliban's concepts in these talks. And my concern and my expectation is, the Taliban, as you rightly point out, they're not going to put themselves out as a political party and expect people to vote for them. I don't see that for 10, 20, 30 years. So what I worry about with these talks is that we end up with an early 1990s, let's divide up the pie of government, right? We have this bigger force, the Taliban, so we'll have that ministry, and we'll do this, and you are a political faction there, and you can have those parts, and the population are going to be sitting on the sidelines watching this, because to me that seems to be about the only plausible compromise you're going to get with the Afghan government as it is at the moment and the Taliban. I can't in any stretch of my imagination see the Taliban setting themselves up as a political movement and going to the polls and going to the people and saying, vote for us, this is what we can bring you. But I mean, I'd welcome your thoughts, Mullins, but I don't see the Taliban setting themselves up in any kind of democratic process.
They might, but they will not do it. Sorry. They might, but they will not do it the way Gulbuddin Hekmatyar did it. That's the reason they're asking for firm promises that they are going to be given authority, not only in terms of getting ministries and so on and so forth, but even expenditure of resources, especially financial resources. Like one of the things that they say, if the US walks out and does not support, even if we reach a deal with the Afghan side, and walks out, does not keep its support intact, there is going to be another civil war, and they're very clear about it. So what I'm trying to say is they want the same kind of levers of leverage that the Afghan elite have right now over the outcome of elections. So they're going to manipulate the votes. They're going to make sure certain sections of society don't vote, and certain sections of society vote. Exactly what the existing structure is. So that's a tricky balance that they have to strike. I don't know the mechanics of it exactly how right now, but I expect these talks, that's why, to continue for a very long time. And I expect if Joe Biden comes to power, I expect a much worse outcome for the talks, because Joe Biden has been very clear since 2009, saying that let Pakistan take the charge, let Pakistanis deal with this. Let's make sure that we are not threatened in any way when it comes to security from this region. Even if they have democracy, not democracy, we don't care about that. So that will be a huge issue. For now, we are lucky to a certain extent that we have Zalmay Khalilzad as the main architect of the deal, who is loyal to some of the so-called achievements of the past 20 years.
Mr. Stott, you wanted to say something?
Yes, just very briefly. I just wanted to add a little something on Tim's point of the danger of seeing governments and the functions of government as a sort of pie, and you divide up different functions around the different participants or the different parties, armed groups that are vying for power. Because of course we have an example from Northern Ireland where we had a peace process that arguably goes some of the way to doing just that, that the parties are, they're tied together in an assembly with quite a complicated structure, so one community can't dominate the other. But it's actually a very different process from traditional Western liberal democracy. The individual isn't sovereign, the individual is tied, is seen as a voter for a party on one of two sides of the sectarian divide usually. And whilst that process has been very successful in stopping violence or reducing the level of violence, politically it hasn't been a great success, in that usually that parliament isn't sitting, it isn't able to reach agreements, and it isn't able to make progress. And so there's a danger of coming at this from a sort of UK perspective and trying things which have worked to some extent in the UK, because I don't think they've quite worked as well as we sometimes try and convince ourselves that they have.
Thank you. It could, of course, what has been indicated a little bit as by the Taliban as well. They're waiting for the Americans to get out, and it could, of course, also end up a new situation like the mid-90s, where you have another civil war, and then whoever backs the Taliban might find himself in a good position. A few other questions, which I'm again going to put together, okay. One is, while ISIS has been weak in Kashmir, but many ISIS sympathizers have been arrested, traveled from central and southern states of India, showing ISIS greater influence in those parts. Why does such a dichotomy exist? And to that is, ISIS presence in South India is larger when compared to Kashmir. What, according to you, is it that motivates youth from South India to join ISIS? And and to that is two questions together, is that ISIS presence in India and in South Asia is more on social media, while open platforms like Twitter can be monitored, but it's hard to monitor encrypted platforms. And in this case, how can we fight online radicalization and the propaganda and ideology being propagated by ISIS to the youth on these platforms? So mainly the South India connection and the radicalization online. It's just for me to give an introduction to that. It is true that most of the recruits from India who have joined ISIS ideologically or physically have come from the south of India as compared to the rest of India. At the same time, and that's a worry, and that should be addressed. At the same time, in terms of percentage to the Muslim population in India, it's of course minuscule to compare to other places like the UK or in South Asia. Of course, you have the Maldives, which have the most foreign fighters. So with a population of 220 million Muslims, I think the number is in dozens from India. But yes, it is of course something to note is that it has mainly been from South India. So if anyone could, and of course the online propaganda, if anyone could take that.
Yeah, I don't exactly know what is going on in the south of India. I mean, that's the important question. You always have to look at the local dynamics. Obviously, you have some core factors behind people's motivation to join these kind of groups, but then you also have some intervening factors, triggers. And obviously, the advent of social media, the ability of people to transfer information and knowledge at the same time, misinformation is so great now that indoctrination and radicalization can be done extremely easily. But at the same time, like looking at Kashmir, there are genuine grievances amongst the population Kashmir, that could be the main factor. But if you're not given the opportunity to explore options for taking action, then again, you basically you're kind of in a limbo. But when you're given options, and that's what Pakistan has created in this region, it has created this environment within which a lot of jihadist groups and outfits and individuals thrive. Literally, it has shared its sovereignty, like with the Lal Masjid in Islamabad. Lal Masjid has its own sovereignty over its premises in on a very micro level. But on a bigger level, there are groups like the Pakistani Taliban. They have their own territories. So Pakistan has taken that calculated or not calculated risk of sharing its sovereignty, creating this environment within which you're indoctrinated in jihad, and you're given reasons to fight against countries like India, the Americans in Afghanistan, or Afghanistan in general. So the motivations can be manifold, and that's why one has to look at every case individually.
Yes, Mr. Daud.
Yes, could I say a little? I just want to say a little thing on the social media point. One of the first international advocates for Islamic State was a Twitter account called Shami Witness. I don't know if people remember the account, but it ran for quite a while. And Shami Witness was an English language account. I certainly wasn't alone in thinking this was probably a British Muslim who was either in Syria or knew people who was, but eventually British media worked out who it was, and it was actually an individual in India who'd got various contacts around the world and was using his Twitter account to promote IS assiduously. The reality is, though, that I think certainly Twitter did get a handle on dealing with extremist material and got a lot better, certainly by probably 2016, 2017. And what you've tended to see since is a lot of this migrate to other new platforms. Telegram is certainly one. And in some cases, these are social media apps that are controlled outside of any of the the Western liberal democracies, for example. So you can't put pressure on them in the same way that, you know, Google or Facebook can be called to appear in front of a parliamentary select committee or be put under pressure in the media. If you've got people who are running TamTam's another example, you know, that's run in Russia, for example, well, you know, the Russians will clamp down on it if they want to, if it's in their interests, if enough diplomatic pressure is put on them. So it's quite difficult to clear the decks of this type of material from all social media platforms. I would, though, reiterate that yes, social media is part of the grease for the system of radicalization, but it's probably not as important as group identities and of groups of friends or extended families who join organizations. You know, that seems to be one of the key factors, certainly for Britons traveling to Syria, for joining jihadist groups in the Indian subcontinent, groups of mates more than, you know, they're radicalized online individually.
Anyone else want, Mr. Foxley, you want to add something to that?
No, that's well beyond my my pay grade.
I might just add, Junaid, quickly add that, like, and it's not only this single Twitter account or single Facebook account. What happens in Afghanistan nowadays is that pro-Taliban individuals come online. They have these live debates with other people, and literally thousands of people tune in and listen to the debates. So they found this way, and they stay online for hours and hours and hours. So they found a very effective way of, if not physically present with these thousands of people, of communicating their message to them.
As far as South India are concerned, we have touched upon it. To my mind, what I feel is that South Asia has, South India, there are more recruits from there, because if you look at the diaspora in the Middle East, that comes mainly from South India. People in South India work in Saudi Arabia, in other places in the Middle East. We've also seen during the course of history, of course, that many of these people who came back to South India, where the mosques are built in South Indian style. Even there are mosques in South India which would from the outside resemble a temple, but it's actually a mosque. Like even mosques in Kashmir are more, an Arab would not recognize it directly as a mosque. It has a different architecture, more towards Central Asia. And the same goes for South Asia, which had a more, South India, which had a more architecture related to the region. And many of these people who returned with a lot of money from the Middle East actually rebuilt these mosques in Arab architecture. So I think it has also to do with the fact that there are more people from South India in the Middle East. There's one question directly towards Mr. Tim Foxley, and that is, what do you think is the relevance of Abdullah's visit to Pakistan during the ongoing intra-Afghan talks?
I haven't followed his visit. I know he went. I can't read anything particular into it. I mean, it's an important reach out. I mean, if you go back through the history of it, Abdullah and the Northern Alliance have historically more connections with India. But I guess you know, he's representing the Afghan government. It's Pakistan, probably the most important factor to keep on side with in Afghan Taliban negotiations than any other country. That has been for years and always will be. So you know, it's important to keep the links. It's important to keep talking. It's important to update the Pakistanis on what they're doing and thinking in relation to the talks. I couldn't say anything more than that, really. I mean, it's Malays, maybe have a bit of
yes, I know the inside story. Unfortunately, it has very little to do with the peace process, and a lot to do with the rivalry between Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, because the recent power sharing deal that was struck between them, Abdullah was assured by President Ghani that he will have full control of the peace process. However, the president reneged predictably very quickly on that promise. And Abdullah, his staff have not been paid for months now, despite the fact that he had explicit promise that they will have all the resources available to them. So he is taking the initiative now, building or rebuilding some of the relationships regionally. And this is for the long term in the future. He has the ambitions of becoming the president. And he's trying to curb the influence of another politician, Hanif Atmar, who's now the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he's slated to be the president after Ashraf Ghani gives up power. So now there is this dynamic going on. Abdullah is trying to make sure that he has the regional powers on his side, and in the process, if he achieves the approval of the Pakistan and getting closer to the Taliban and making sure that peace prevails, that will also be something that he will kind of denote as his achievement. So it has more to do with domestic politics than the peace process.
Let me slip around my failure to answer the question then, because it is the thing that again makes me get slightly tense in my stomach. The rivalries between Ghani and Abdullah and those sort of factions, and it, I mean, we had them both inaugurating themselves earlier this year as both as presidents, didn't we? Which was an unedifying spectacle. So it causes me concerns. And when I'm projecting ahead sort of scenarios we could see for Afghanistan the next sort of 2, 3, 5 years, one of the things that worries me is that the government system will start to fragment and start pulling into at the moment it would be an Abdullah faction and a Ghani faction, or so, something like that. Do you? Maybe I'm asking you, Malays. How do you see that rivalry, or is it just one of those things? Because yeah, it's good that Abdullah is going to Pakistan, getting the links, acting presidential, but I worry that this rivalry is quite deep rooted and has the potential to get in the way of the important business of talking with the Taliban.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I remember in 2012, I had a presentation at USIP in Washington, D.C., and one of the main achievements there, I said, was this cohesion of our elite back then. When it comes to the main objectives, one of them was the state, having a state. The second one was the democracy, elections, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, we no longer have that cohesion. And President Ghani has a big hand there, because the way he played politics, isolating people like former President Karzai, to whom he should be thankful for his power, actually, and in the process breaking many promises, and also getting overly excited over minor issues. Like one of the things he initially thought that Pakistani Chief of Army Staff is he's honest in his promises when he says, I'm going to deliver Taliban, he's going to deliver Taliban. The Pakistanis obviously didn't do that, and then he became extremely aggravated and he attacked Pakistanis more vigorously. So he made lots of enemies in the region, or telling the Russians that you're sending your, I don't exactly remember the wording, but anyhow, all of your dirt to Afghanistan and so on and so forth. So in the region, the consensus right now is no one wants to deal with President Ghani. Even Indians are wary of dealing with President Ghani. That's why people like Abdullah and Hanif Atmar are trying to make sure that in the future, they are the ones who can go to the region and say, we are the ones who are going to make sure that your interests remain intact in Afghanistan. Whereas President Ghani has other horses that he's bet on, like his national security advisor, Mohib, who's a young chap. So the fissures are extremely big now and almost irreconcilable. And that would be one of the main failures of us, even if we reach a deal with the Taliban.
Daud, do you have anything to add? No? Okay. We'll go further. Again, I'm going to put a few questions together, which are similar. One is, hello, I'm from Kashmir. Is Pakistan ISI sponsoring ISIS in Pakistan against Indian administrated Kashmir? I think you've touched upon it, but there's another question which is also close to that, is how is ISKP getting ground to proliferate in South Asia, and is that with the help of Pakistan? Then there is a counter question which is totally different from that one, so we can put it together, is many researchers suggest that ISIS is funded by global superpowers. To what extent is that true? And next to that, this is the regular conspiracy theories. The world superpowers, particularly the US, seems more concerned to eradicate the roots of ISIS in European countries, Iraq and Syria, but seems less concerned towards its rise in South Asia. Why is that? And how do you see the rise of South ISIS in South India and its linkage to the issue of Kashmir? I think we have discussed that. But so basically, there are two people who are asking, is Pakistan sponsoring ISIS, and maybe not in Pakistan, but sponsoring it against India and particularly in Indian administrated Kashmir? And the other question is from someone else who says, well, actually, ISIS is being funded by global superpowers, and the world superpowers are only interested in getting it eradicated in European countries and not in South Asia. So that's to all of you, I guess.
Can I go on the issue of whether ISI has any links to the ISIS? The problem is, if you talk to the security officers of Afghanistan, they will all point to the hallmarks of attacks of the ISIS and say they're extremely similar to the attacks conducted by the Haqqani network. So they say ISIS is a totally different face now. When Taliban or the Pakistani ISI would like to conduct an attack, just blaming it on ISIS, simply they basically say, okay, we are not supporting this, but actually they are doing it. We haven't seen any evidence. But again, the insurgency landscape is so fluid. Material, people, even resources are shared widely and extensively. Like literally, there was one cell in the southeast of Kabul that was providing logistical support both to ISIS and Haqqani network for conducting attacks. That you don't exactly know who's done. There are some very clear attacks, like the attacks against the Shias, which the Taliban have tried to a great extent to minimize. Those are conducted by the so-called ISIS, whereas the sectarian attacks. Whereas when it comes to other attacks, we still don't know exactly whether this was the Haqqani network or it was ISIS. But the whole discussion in Afghanistan is that the ground for all this has been made by the Pakistani ISI, and they're keeping ISIS as an option, so an open option when, in case somebody else like the Taliban, they kind of free themselves from their circle of influence. The second question, I haven't seen, and I've done extensive research on this, I haven't seen any evidence of the Western powers, particularly the US, supporting ISIS. On the contrary, they've been extremely heavy-handed to the extent that they've partnered with the Taliban. This year, they partnered with the Taliban to conduct one attack, at least I have the evidence of one, against the ISIS. So to that extent, they're prepared to go. And obviously, as I said, the biggest bomb, a nuclear bomb, they didn't drop it on the Taliban, they dropped it on ISIS.
Mr. Paul Stott, so it's not the good old Britishers selling weapons to India and Pakistan, but apparently the superpowers are also sponsoring ISIS.
Yes, we'll let the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians take the blame. Perhaps I'm not sure Britain counts as a superpower these days, but I think there's a very particular concern that the Western powers, the European nations, had with the rise of Islamic State, and that was the close proximity of that conflict to Europe. And in time, when it became more and more clear that large numbers of people from the UK, or comparatively large numbers from the UK, Germany, France, Belgium were travelling, that did get people to sort of prick up their attention. I think initially in the early days of the Syrian civil war, the sort of 2011, 2012 period, there may have been a little bit of naivety about some of the players in the field, or there was the sort of search for a group that we could do business with, and certainly the British government was providing what it referred to as non-lethal aid to the Syrian opposition at one stage. I think that was probably unwise. I think it's worth stressing here the first attack by a returning fighter was 2014, a shooting in Brussels that was carried out by a French jihadist returning. And then by the time of 2015, when you get the Paris attacks, it was absolutely clear that Islamic State wanted to bring its war to Europe, and it would be sending former fighters from Syria, from Iraq to do that. So I don't think that the proposition stands that the West is, supporting or in control of these groups. So I would probably leave my position at that, really. That I think the facts are to the contrary in practice.
Oxley, you want to add something?
Yeah. I mean, it's just kind of to reiterate, really. Are the ISI? Who are the ISI sponsoring in the area? I mean, the ISI, as we all know, have an extensive history of sponsoring the Taliban. By many arguments, helped bring them into being. As Malays has said, and I'm just kind of echoing what he's been presenting, that I don't see any reporting, from day to day or month to month, that the ISI are pushing Islamic State, ISKP, or ISIS, or anything like that. But the bottom line in this area, Pakistan is looking after Pakistan's interests, Pakistan's strategic interests, and they've demonstrated, and they still continue to demonstrate, that terrorist organizations operate from their soil, and they have promoted terrorist groups that have operated beyond Pakistan. So I don't rule anything out in terms of ISI behavior. And Malay's made a good point that I should have made in my talk, that it's really difficult on the ground to pin down who is conducting operations for who. And absolutely, Malay said the Haqqani network, ISKP, Taliban, particularly at the local level, there's a lot of kind of interactions. I mean, we used to have Afghan Taliban that have joined, local Islamic State groups, and they've moved around, and factions come and go, and it's quite fluid. So it's certainly possible that ISI support or has made its way to Islamic State or ISKP. Maybe by accident, maybe by design. It's difficult to pinpoint that. And the bigger issue, ISIS funded by global superpowers. No, I don't think there's no credible answer for that. And in terms of maybe the Americans are focusing, or the West is focusing on defeating ISIS in the West and ignoring places like Afghanistan. Well, I mean, the Americans put a lot of effort into trying to defeat the Taliban and Islamic State. It's harder to do certain things. You can't drop bombs in the UK and go after ISIS groups, but you can't penetrate particular sort of communications networks that easily in Afghanistan. So you're using brute force instead. So there are particular sets of challenges that the West have in reaching places like Pakistan, Nuristan province and Kunar province. I mean, and the Americans are reduced to kind of, brute military force most of the time. And, there are some people maybe criticizing the Americans for not getting involved and bombing ISIS. But there's a lot of Afghans and Pakistanis on the ground who are fed up with people dropping bombs in their areas. So I get, there's no perfect solution. I don't think there's a particular policy to ignore Islamic State in certain areas. It's just harder to do things. It's harder to target people in certain areas.
Okay, one question is, Taliban continues to maintain ties with regional and Pakistan-based terror groups even after signing the peace deal, do you think the Taliban has any intentions to reach a political agreement through negotiations, or the discussions primarily are just a means of getting the US military off the battlefield?
Well, I think that, you know, the Taliban are in it for the Taliban's own objectives, and they're taking it stage by stage. I think when the Americans have gone, a lot of pressure will be off them, because the Americans aren't coming back. There's no you know, battle groups or anything going to come back into Afghanistan and change the balance of power. So the priority at the moment is to wait for the Americans to go, and I suspect this is why probably the talks at the moment, they'll drag on, and they'll wait and see what happens in was it spring next year. The Americans are supposed to be all entirely gone.
Yeah.
And the Brits and everyone else will follow the same pattern, I expect. So we won't see much go on at the moment. There'll be a lot of talk, but ultimately, again, from what I've seen, from what I've read, from the people I spoke to, I don't think the Taliban are really looking at a compromise in the way that maybe we would perceive a compromise, or the Afghan government or the Afghan population might see compromise. I think they will wait and see and get as much as they can. So in that respect, yeah, they're prepared to wait out the time, let the Americans go, and then see how things lie.
Can I come in? I think it depends on different factors and different actors within the Taliban. There are Taliban who are genuinely committed to a deal, who genuinely think, like Mullah Baradar, the head of their political office in Doha, he was even negotiating with President Kaiser before all this, long ago, more than 10 years ago, and then he was put in prison by the Pakistani state. So he is someone who's willing to do that. But within Taliban, we also have these kind of transnationalists, the globalists, who believe in the same kind of, they sympathize with Muslims elsewhere. They would like jihad to continue in Palestine and places like Syria and so on and so forth. So it will be extremely difficult to reconcile them. But at the same time, it depends on what kind of a deal you're going to give them. So if a deal, as Tim said, suits them, and they get as much as possible, then they are going to go for it. But there are points that they understand really well. One of the things is that if the US cuts all its financial and military and other support, they also stand to lose. So most of the people within Taliban I've spoken to, they don't believe in Afghanistan of early 1990s, and they don't think they can be a party to that kind of a chaos, which they think uprooted by capturing almost all of the country in the first place. So they're saying that this support is important to continue to have a state, but what kind of a state? That is the important question. Who's going to be the participant in this state? Is it going to be the women in leadership positions? Unacceptable. Women going to schools and low-level jobs and some specialized jobs like doctors and teachers, that is acceptable. So they have evolved, but not to the point that would be acceptable for the other side and also for the international community at large. But there are also a lot of suspicion within the Taliban, as well as in the broader picture in Afghanistan. No one still believes that the international community is going to leave. So they're still of the belief that the Americans will stay. And that's why they're preparing for that scenario more than for a peaceful scenario where they'll become part of the power structure.
Scott, you have anything to add?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. We were supposed to finish at 5. There are still a few questions. I think I'm going to take the liberty to put them all together in one, and then you all can have, of course, I think a wrap-up comment while also trying to answer those questions, and I'll put a footnote towards mine. One is asking about the impact of COVID. I think Mr. Polstad has discussed that in his presentation, so that we're going to leave that. There's one question which I'm going to put together and make it a bit of a geostrategic question with my own footnotes next to it. There has been an Afghan-US peace deal. Then you have suddenly in the Middle East, you have certain countries starting to talk to Israel and having to recognize Israel. And then you have networks of Turkey of ISIS in Turkey, still in that area, and you also have this new counterbalance in world politics coming up, which some translate into the new Muslim superpower alliances, Turkey, Pakistan, maybe China with them, maybe Russia, and Iran even. So how do you see Turkey, ISIS over there, the Middle East, some countries recognizing Israel, and this new sort of alliance building up? How will that impact the region?
So fairly straight and easy question then. How do we solve the Middle East? I'm gonna try and keep this really simple, otherwise I'll confuse myself. I mean, the Afghan-US deal and the countries talking to Israel, and there've been a couple of American announcements, haven't there? I'm still suspicious about this is the Donald Trump era still, and things are happening which don't necessarily add up to anything, or they are they're fronts and facades to as part of this, as Donald Trump goes kicking and screaming out of government. The COVID impact on Afghanistan, I mean, just to reiterate again, I think it's having a big impact in Afghanistan, economically, politically, militarily. It's going to potentially disrupt the talks. But above all, it has big impact on the desire of the Americans, the Europeans, to put money into Afghanistan. And this is so the COVID's having an effect on the ground, but geostrategically, this could have a big dent in the sort of support that's coming to Afghanistan. I don't have anything really useful to say about the Middle East there, except that America has now dwindled. Its global place is eroding away, and that maybe that happened before Donald Trump. But we are now getting, the Turkey, the Russians, the Iranians, what I would have called the middle-sized powers, now pushing themselves forward, and they're no longer doing this in a tentative way. They're actually getting strength and confidence. So I don't think this is particularly a good thing for what we're going to see in the Middle East and Central Asia. So I have concerns for the next couple of years. I have concerns for every year.
On the regional issues, I remember 2013 and 14 and 15 that the Russians, every time they had this bilateral mechanism with the Americans, every time they talked to the US, the only issue that they had consensus on was Afghanistan. But then as the situation progressively deteriorated in Syria, in Ukraine, those two places affected their relationship with the Americans in Afghanistan. And obviously, the Iranians became a much bigger spoiler. The Chinese had some minor projects with the US for confidence building in Afghanistan. But as relatively China and these other powers became stronger, I don't know if you've read this book, American Century, in which the main thesis of the author is that it's not the US that is going to become weaker. It's going to be other countries, especially China, to become stronger. So they've gained more confidence now. And it's not necessarily a good thing for countries like Afghanistan. And obviously this division between, on the one side, kind of the Shia Muslim world spearheaded by Iran, and the Sunni Muslim world spearheaded by Saudi Arabia, that division also plays into the conflict in Afghanistan, and not necessarily in the most positive of ways. Turkey is a major power in Afghanistan, Pakistan. At least it's perceived as that, and at the same time, Turkey has its own issues with the US and its presence in the Middle East. So if I compared it to 10 years ago and 20 years ago, one of the main reasons the conflict has escalated is that there's no longer a regional consensus, there's no longer an international consensus in this region, particularly Afghanistan. So that's a huge issue. I don't remember the second question. I did have an answer for the question, but
We'll go to Mr. Paul Stott, and then we'll give
yes,
one at the end.
sure.
Comment, of course.
Yes, I think all those activists who, at the time of the Gulf War, wanted America to step back from from international affairs. Well, we're now seeing that beginning to happen. That creates some big challenging questions for some countries. You know, if Trump's been consistent, it's that he wants to see other nations take responsibility. Is Germany going to step up and be a big player in NATO? No, I don't think it is. So, you know, if that means with a NATO, Trump's prepared to go along with that. Whether a future American president will, we don't know. But as America steps back, that creates space for other countries. Russia in recent years, in the Middle East, China internationally, and obviously Turkey. So whether that's necessarily healthy for the international system, we don't necessarily know. I mean, if you look at, for example, Saudi Arabia's conduct in Yemen, it has been deeply problematic. It's been brutal. So you know, the big players stepping back and allowing regional players to predominate. Yes, it's happening. It's not necessarily going to be very nice.
Because they don't take, because if it is China, they don't take security, human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression that seriously as the West might do.
They're even against them.
Well, I've dismissed a few questions because they were, you have covered them, all of you, in your presentations. I'm just going to give the order we started with the speakers. So Mr. Tim Foxley, and then Mr. Paul Stott, and then Mr. Malays Daud to make some final comments before I wrap up. Mr. Foxley?
Yeah, thank you, Junaid. I've really enjoyed taking part in this. I've got to talk about my thoughts about Afghanistan as a whole as we move into these peace talks. There are clearly a lot of things that can go wrong. It's a good thing that talks are taking place in any shape or form, but I think most of my thoughts and most of my writing is based around the concern when I look at the scenarios, the ways in which things can develop in the next 2 to 5 years. I personally feel that the chances of a civil war are getting closer. I think we approach it maybe like a perfect storm of things that can go wrong. I don't think the Taliban have compromise in mind. I think the Americans are rushing out in an embarrassingly fast fashion. And COVID is one more layer of problems that we're seeing in Afghanistan. So I'm pessimistic for the future, and bringing it back to the point of my presentation. And I think ISKP, although they are, and we've heard and I agree, in the region, maybe their capacity, they're struggling in many ways in terms of recruitment and capability. They have the capacity to really disrupt things. With a bomb here, a mass terrorist incident there, particularly in Kabul, right at the point where a delicate talk's taking. And as we've discussed with Malays, it's not easy to pinpoint who's actually committed a particular atrocity, and the overlaps between Taliban, Haqqani network, ISKP will make it always a bit problematic. And I think ISKP will know that and capitalize on that. So maybe they'll do an attack and claim it. Maybe they'll do an attack and not claim it. Maybe they'll blame someone else. So with their capability is small, but they have a lot of potential to disrupt things. And this is a very delicate period. And I think things have the potential to go in the wrong direction. And ISKP can make this worse. Sorry, with apologies for the level of pessimism, but that's my thought.
Thank you, Mr. Stott.
Yes, I think in terms of Islamic State and its campaign, we're currently in a lull. we don't know to what extent the group is able to successfully reorganize itself. What I would say from a particularly British perspective is we had a similar lull in jihadist violence. I think after 7/7, nobody was killed by a jihadist attack in Britain until 2013, when Soldier Lee Rigby was killed, and that was a particularly divisive attack and one that was particularly damaging for race relations in the UK. So just because these issues aren't to the forefront doesn't mean that they're not going to reappear, and when they do reappear, both domestically and internationally, they can be so damaging. What I would say from my own research and understanding is pretty much anywhere where armed Sunni groups have picked up the gun, there are Britons supporting those groups and travelling to join them, and that will happen in Afghanistan again if the peace process breaks down.
Thank you. Mr. Malez?
Yeah, I think I would like to talk about the approach, the general approach that there is, which is about firefighting, you know, like ISIS is in Afghanistan, let's fight, you know. So this too much of fixation on particular actors instead of addressing the whole issue, which is this jihadist landscape, and particularly the question of state sponsorship, which is basically how Pakistan behaves and its military behaves. That is the most important question. So I think the engagement with the Pakistan military to impress upon them that they give up on certain ways in which they are trying to advance their foreign policy goals, that will be much more effective than fixation on particular individual groups and actors. That's the first thing. The second thing is I think it is time for some creative solutions now. We've tried state for building. I disagree with even with the terminology, because states are formed, they're never built from outside. So instead of overly focusing on state building, trying to have these what we call the security sector reform and have military forces operate against the jihadist outfits, I guess from the example of the Pashtun Tahfuz movement in Pakistan, we see that they're much more effective against the Pakistan and Afghan Taliban in terms of uncovering their plans and also resisting against them on the ground. So maybe it is time, instead of using violence to deflect violence, using non-violent resistance, it is time to engage more in more depth with these actors instead of using warlords in Afghanistan or using the Pakistani military in Pakistan and trying to curb the activities of the jihadi outfits.
Thank you. I think we can wrap up with making the comments that indeed it is unknown how ISIS will develop, but because of the fragile situation in different countries in South Asia and South Asia as a whole, there is a chance that if they will re-emerge, South Asia is the place where that could happen, whether that's physically or we already see it on social media. And I think what was said at the end, indeed, which is also a question that democracy should be strengthened, and then these democratic actors like the PTM or other non-violent movements are probably the best movement, the best ways to fight these violent movements. And as Malez has said at the end, and Paul Stott, Dr. Stott has said it as well, and Mr. Foxley as well, that indeed in this whole thing, and I keep saying it also in relation to Indo-Pak, but you here see that even in relation to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, and the region, that this one institution, which is definitely a formidable institution, which is the Pakistani military establishment and the Pakistani army, that remains key, or at least their approach towards these things remains key. I would just like to actually suggested at the end, and this is something I came to know because we were we wanted to do this in Geneva, and then it got the UN canceled those side events. Then we wanted to do it in the city of Geneva, but then of course, because of restrictions, that couldn't happen. Malaise was even planning to come to Amsterdam, and then he couldn't come because again, quarantine rules. I think it's maybe a very good idea. We can think about it. You all have mentioned different things, and then at least I think none of our attendees even got bored because we still have around 40-50 people on the list. Maybe it's an idea now that we are with this COVID restrictions to that EFSAS starts in the coming months, maybe one-on-one interviews on different topics with any one of you other research fellows we have, where we can really go in depth. You know, many of our attendees might be wondering what exactly PTM is. This Pashtun Tahdun, many people don't know about it. And of course, the British connection, I think many South Asian people would be very interesting because of the fact that there is a huge South Asian and of course also a big Kashmiri diaspora in Britain, of course. And of course, Mr. Tim Foxley's observations about the pessimism he has regarding the peace process over there. So I think we'll get in touch with you, but I think that would be a very, very good thing to do. For now, I would like to thank you all for participating. It was really enlightening. I think also for our attendees, especially now that it's always difficult to get new people at the UN or at different conferences. And now we have seen, I think out of all the people, half of them were directly logged in from Kashmir itself. And then we had people from India and Pakistan, and then of course Europe. So I think we can reach a bigger audience like this. I'm even wondering whether I need an office now or not, but thank you very much for joining, and hopefully we can do this soon again. Thank you. See you soon.